So Saturday marks the end of the Bellator era, going out with a bang. This is a great fight. Make sure you guys tune in. But I thought I'd count down the top 5 MMA promotions outside of the UFC in MMA history. Let's get right into it. First off, going to start with some honorable mentions. One Championship, has an argument to be on this list, especially if you consider what they do in like Muay Thai and outside of the UFC. Obviously, having Demetrius Johnson did a lot for them, but just haven't done enough to make it. Don't have the iconic moments that these other do yet, but definitely an honorable mention and a great promotion. Jungle Fight's a promotion in Brazil that, for me, needs an honorable mention just because of the absolute amount of legends to come from here. Almost every Brazilian icon comes from Jungle Fight. Aldo, Poatan, Werdum, Jacare. The list goes on and on. They deserve an honorable mention. And then finally, Pancrase. This is the only MMA promotion that really kind of outdates the UFC. It's a little different because it started, like it says, as hybrid wrestling, kind of a mix of professional wrestling and MMA. But, some of the credit for the start of the sport has to go to Pancrase. Really, the first ever superstar in MMA was Ken Shamrock fighting out of Pancrase. And, they also had Bas Rutten, who's one of the most notable stars in all of MMA history. And yeah, now we'll get into the top 5. And 5th place for me is going to be PFL. Obviously right now this is a bit of a hot pick. They're in some hot water. But PFL, formerly World Series of Fighting, for me, the innovation they brought to the sport is really enough to solidify them a spot on this list. What they've done with the smart cage, the tournament, the playoff styles, and, trying to bring some new aspects to judging using verdict and AI. These are all positive things for the sport, and I feel that's why it deserves them a spot in the top 5. Outside of just innovation, we've seen some awesome fights, awesome fighters out of PFL. Obviously, Kayla Harrison, one of the biggest women's superstars in the sport. Back to the WSOF days, that rise of Justin Gaethje was unmatched, so electric. He was undefeated. So many electric, crazy fights. And then obviously signing the ex-UFC heavyweight champion, the reigning UFC heavyweight champion, Francis Ngannou, him getting that big knockout in his debut, having arguably the best heavyweight in the sport on your roster, you deserve some accolades. Now, these next 3 were real tough for me to rank, honestly. 2 through 4 was a complete toss-up. In 4th place, I'm going WEC. For me, what they did for the sport is really tremendous. They brought a spotlight to the younger weight classes that, the UFC wasn't willing to give a chance to flyweight, bantamweight, and featherweight until WEC showed what these guys could do. So many champions to come from this promotion: Dominic Cruz, Jose Aldo, Benson Henderson, Anthony Pettis, and just legends: Korean Zombie, Uriah Faber, Cowboy Cerrone, Chad Mendez, Cub Swanson, and plenty more, and some of the most iconic moments in MMA history. Of course, everyone knows the Showtime kick. One of my all-time favorite fights, Korean Zombie taking on Leonard Garcia. They just threw haymakers for 15 minutes. Shitty decision, but whatever. Jose Aldo knocking out Cub Swanson with a crazy flying knee in 8 seconds. WEC was awesome. 3rd place for me is going to be Bellator. This is by far the promotion I watched outside of the UFC the most, so maybe I'm a little sentimental, but I mean, if you look at the roster, if you look at the fights they've put on, it's really great. They were considered at one point the biggest rival to the UFC, a few years ago. Obviously sucks, how the promotion, had to sell and now is being discarded, but some great moments to come from Bellator. Think of all of Michael Venom Page's crazy highlight reel knockouts. And then him getting absolutely torched by Lima, one of the most vicious knockouts ever. The drama that was the Bellator lightweight division. I mean, Eddie Alvarez versus Michael Chandler was one of the all-time great fights. And then, Patricky Pitbull getting in there versus Michael Chandler, and later AJ McKee. I mean, that lightweight division is arguably one of the best divisions in MMA history. Those guys all went back and forth. Bellator also had one of my all-time favorite events, this New York City card. I mean, the upsets were wild. Aaron Pico losing his debut was nuts. Michael Chandler losing to Brett Primus. The crazy double knockout between Fedor and Mitrione. One of Chael's last ever wins. This card was one of my favorite ever cards I watched. Now in my number 2 is going to be Strikeforce. I think this really was one of the biggest threats to the UFC, and, they were really threatened by it. That's why they bought it, and I think the accusation of Strikeforce specifically is one of the major reasons behind that antitrust lawsuit. I just love the Strikeforce moments, man. To me, it's just absolutely iconic. I know it wasn't as short-lived as some of these other promotions, but just look at some of the cinema that we got during Strikeforce. Fedor Emelianenko was on a 10-year unbeaten streak. He gets triangle choked by Fabrizio Werdum. It was one of the biggest upsets in MMA history. Obviously, the rise of Ronda Rousey. I mean, she's a big reason why Strikeforce was such a big competitor. She's a reason why there's women in the UFC, and one of the all-time, for me, 1, 2, or 3 biggest superstars in MMA history to come from Strikeforce. And then just this post-fight brawl at Strikeforce Nashville, Scrap Pack, Diaz brothers versus the Mayhem Miller brothers. I mean, Mayhem Miller, one of the craziest figures in MMA history, and this got the Strikeforce taken off of CBS and probably, got him in a lot more trouble, but still all-time iconic moment in MMA history. And come on, guys, there was never going to be a doubt who the number one promotion outside of the UFC is. The only promotion to rival and even be bigger than the UFC at one point, Pride. If you guys ever get the chance, go back and watch their Grand Prix. It's some of the best example of MMA, the most pageantry. And that's what Pride did best. It was the pageantry. They made it feel so special. Still to this day, hold by far the largest crowd attendance in MMA history, upwards of 70,000. And Pride was just amazing stuff. You have the legendary fights and fighters. Just look right here, Kevin Randleman slamming Fedor Emelianenko. That whole 10-year unbeaten run of Fedor Emelianenko was in Pride. Wanderlei Silva, if you guys knew about him during the Pride days, the Axe Murderer, one of the scariest guys ever. Mirko Cro Cop, Quentin Rampage Jackson. I mean, look at him slamming this guy, powerbombing him, and Rampage Jackson, UFC had sent over Chuck Liddell to try to take over Pride. Rampage knocks him out. And then the legendary moment, Sakuraba versus Gracie. These guys fought for 90 minutes. 90 minutes, an hour and a half. And then no one did gimmick fights like Pride. Bob Sapp versus Big Nog. I mean, Bob Sapp, look at him spiking Big Nog on his head. Big Nog will go on to submit him. If you guys know this fight, these guys, Don Fry, just punched each other straight in the head. This is Rock'em Sock'em Robot. Pride never die. One of the coolest things in MMA history. By far the best promotion outside of the UFC. No one did pageantry like Pride. No one presented the sport like Pride till this day. And yeah, that's the list, guys. What do you think?